Hello and welcome to the Young Film Academy podcast, the essential podcast for teenagers looking to find their way into the creative industries. My name is Dan Allen. I am joined by Ellen Thomas. How's it going?
Hi Dan, lovely to be with you on this beautiful day.
Very beautiful day. At least I think it is. I'm looking outside and just sort of seeing what looks like the mist of over cloudness, but the confusing
I
sort
more
of
meant
sunbeams
sort of like
to...
It's a beautiful day because we're doing a podcast.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Spiritually, you know what? It is a beautiful day. It is a beautiful day. And we have got an incredibly exciting guest to have on board, don't we, Ellen?
Yes, we do. I don't even know where to begin. I'm almost overwhelmed by how to introduce this guest. But we are joined today by Steve Bernstein, who is a cinematographer, director, screenwriter and author who has worked on some amazing projects spanning a hugely successful and long career, starting off with the highly acclaimed Like Water for Chocolate, one of his early projects, going on to the Oscar-winning Monster with Charlize Theron, and he's shot iconic comedies like White Chicks, Scary Movie 2, Half Baked, and The Waterboy, and then has become more prevalent as a writer and director with his new book out called GRQ, standing for Get Rich Quick, which has now been adapted into a screenplay and movie out in early next year. So yeah, we've got a lot to cover, but we're really excited to speak to Steve.
Absolutely. So without any further ado, welcome to the podcast, Steve. How's it going?
It's good. Thanks very much.
So, Steve, I have to start with one of my favourite films, Scary Movie 2. I absolutely love that franchise and that world. Big fan of the third one as well. Obviously, you worked on it, which is super cool, but I heard that things were not as fun on set as they were sort of on screen, as it were. Could you possibly give any more inside information into this and sort of what happened?
So it's funny that you should mention Scary Movie 2. It was a remarkable experience in that Scary Movie 1 was a bigger success than they had imagined. So we rushed into production for Scary Movie 2, and they hadn't really quite finished the script. And the script was really never finished until our last day of actual photography. So the plan that we evolved was to shoot not on one stage, but on 4 or 5 different stages.
Okay.
And we would be lighting in one stage, and we'd be shooting in another, and we'd be building in another, and we'd have one of those little golf carts they have studios here in Los Angeles. So we were in the Hollywood North Studios, and we would beetle between the different stages, set up, do the shot, get the crew to them, start working on the next one, then go back to another set. So it was absolute chaos, and we had, I think, 7 different editors working on different scenes as well.
Okay, wow.
So we'd be getting feedback from different people. We'd be shooting different places. We'd be bringing crew in. We'd be writing scenes. We'd be shooting the scenes. We'd hear about what was going on in another set. We'd go to that other set. We would shoot it. So it was chaotic. It was wild.
It sounds extremely chaotic.
Yeah, it was kind of fun, but considering the money that was being thrown at it, I don't know if it was as much fun for the producers as it was for all of us. And we just presumed that anything that engendered in the theater would not cut together, wouldn't be logical. There would be no story. There would be no arc. The characters wouldn't be developed. And in fact, it, at least in Hollywood terms of what success is, it made a lot of money. People laughed a great deal. And because of the nature of the film, which is a series of roughly sewn together vignettes, it worked. I'd also say that the atmosphere that you have on set very often appears on screen.
Yes.
In the happiest films I've worked on, when the crew has been tightest, and it becomes really an extension of like a family, which is what makes film sets so special and so addictive, and why ultimately, once you do a film, you want to keep doing them because of that connection you make with other people. Those are the films very often that have been most successful. Monster, we all got very, very close on the film with Charlize and Christina.
Yeah.
We had very little money. Again, conditions were difficult, hot, humid. We were in a great rush to finish things. And we had presumed that the film couldn't possibly be a success. It was about woman serial killer. The temperatures in Florida that time of year were diabolical. We were shooting in locations with tin roofs, and the my camera assistant passed out from heat exhaustion one day. We fired a large part of the crew for a variety of reasons,
Oh,
and then when the
wow.
film finished, no one would buy it. But I must tell you, we had a great time while we were shooting it because we we bound the crew, we connected with each other because of the adversity that we were facing.
Yeah,
And again, the
yeah,
film was obviously a huge success. It went on to win an Oscar. Was done for a very small sum of money, made an enormous sum of money. It started in 2 cinemas and then ended up in nearly 1,000 cinemas. Just a great story for a little tiny independent. And I don't
yeah,
think that the connection is accidental. I think that something happens in the creative process that when you're collaborating in that way and you feel a closeness, there's a intuitive communication that occurs with you and other people where you surrender part of yourself and your ego, where imposing your will becomes less important than the common good, which is making the best film. And that's why
yeah,
those films, I think, are successful. I
for
could tell you about
sure.
some of the worst experiences I've had with crews where everyone disliked each other, and not surprisingly, the films were awful. But I won't mention those here.
I think, yeah, I think you can really tell when it shines through. And I'd be interested to hear like what stages of your career you are at in those two different experiences. So when you were shooting Scary Movie and the other film you mentioned.
Yeah, Monster with Charlize Theron.
Monster, yeah.
I was uh, kind of the same. They weren't that far apart. I had started out in the UK. I was American born, but had worked in the UK, BBC, etc. Through some strange accidents, and they were accidents. I mean, what a lot of people do at my time in life is they look back on their life and they pretend that it was all ordered and structured, and
Yeah, and
that
everything happened for a reason.
I have my favorite expression: "Everything happens for a reason." And you had a plan. In fact, I don't think any of us have a plan, or at least we don't have a plan that actually then actually works or functions. The old joke, how you make God laugh, make a plan. So I had lots of plans and ambitions. I wanted to be a writer most of all,
Yeah.
and then somebody decided that because A&R men, people at record companies that would look for bands, didn't have an easy way to access bands in London in the early 80s, they would shoot a video of them against like a white sheet, and then give the video to the A&R men, and they would discover bands, they would discover recording artists. And that worked. And then somebody said, well, why don't we do little stories around these bands? And then they started doing little stories. And then within 2 years, Duran was spending £1 million on doing a music video. And that's how music videos were engendered. I was there at that time, and I had access, shamefully, to the BBC cameras,
Wow.
shamefully, because one shouldn't borrow things from corporations for whom you were working. And I presume the statute of limitations has run out. And when I come back to the UK, I can't now be arrested. But I returned all eventually. But we would take cameras away on weekends, shamefully, and we would film these music videos. And the videos grew bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And what was great about that particular accident was the BBC was very ordered and structured and had a system, an orthodoxy about the way everything should be done. And I think that's great. There's lots of books out now, for example, about how scripts should be written, which I do whole podcasts about how you shouldn't read them, but that's a different story. And then I went to the chaos of music videos, where none of us knew what we were doing or what really would have the greatest impact. So we would experiment wildly, unfettered, and sometimes we would fail spectacularly, which is an essential part of development, which is the desire to fail spectacularly. And sometimes we would succeed spectacularly. And as we would succeed, we start discovering new things. I don't think a lot of films, for example, had backlight with wet downs. A wet down where you take a water truck and you spray it all over the ground. so the light will kick back from the light. And then we would put what was called party gels in those days, colors on the lights, which very few people were doing on feature films or in commercials. And we were using like deep blues and strange reds and yellows. So we were putting these party gels on lights. We were backlighting, we were doing wet downs. Then we started experimenting with reducing the quality of the image using a Fisher Price toy camera for one music video. You're shooting something on Super 8, some things on 35, sometimes on 70 millimeter. We'd, when I was working with Tony Kaye later on commercials, we put every imaginable filter in front of the lens arbitrarily with no particular plan. The problem with planning is it presumes that you know everything you're going to know already. There's a great American writer named Joan Didion who said she writes to discover what she thinks. I think that's part of the creative process is you have to do to discover. And if you try to plan everything beforehand, you're missing an opportunity to access a creative part of yourself that is only accessible if you actually do it. So in music videos, that wild experimentation juxtaposed with the formality of my education at the BBC combined to then put me on a career path and a life that I wouldn't have had if I couldn't have combined that to chaos and order, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes loads of sense, and it shows how sort of open you are as a creative, and I think that really shows in like the different fields that you've jumped into and found yourself in.
Yeah, and I didn't answer your question. How was that my career? Then, right after that, I should say that somebody saw some of my work, and particularly a film I did called Like Water for Chocolate, which was an independent film that another friend of mine, Gabriel Bernstein, was in the same world, became a very famous cinematographer. It was Mexican and was invited to Mexican to go work on a independent film that was in great trouble in a place called La Junia in northern Mexico, and couldn't do the job. And they were paying really no money at all. In fact, it turned out to be no money. I mean, not figuratively, I mean no money. They promised me money, which is a great trick of producers, because if they promise you money and then don't pay it, it reduces their overhead.
Yeah.
So I flew over to Mexico for what was meant to be a 2-week job. I was there for 6 months, and we shot this really troubled little film. It became a huge phenomenon, the highest foreign language film of all time at that point. And then I was invited to come to Hollywood to be a cinematographer. So I flew out, and like everybody, seduced by the place, because when you first get here, you think, I'm here. You know, you go through the gates of Paramount. There's a huge gate over your head that says Paramount. You see these ancient buildings go into a giant soundstage, and you think, oh, I'm validated. This is real. I often say that, at least for me, I'm so disassociated that until something resembles a movie, it doesn't seem real to me. So my life at that point was resembling a movie, so it began to seem real, and therefore I seemed validated. And then I began getting gigs. It wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. I wasn't in the union at that point. Water for Chocolate was still an independent film for all success. But then I began working on different sorts of movies, and I didn't realize the impact that my decisions would have then. So I thought, do a comedy, do a drama. In the UK, that doesn't matter. In the US, you specialize. So when I did my first comedy, then somebody said, Water for Chocolate was pretty dark and pretty, but now he does comedies. So then I started getting offered comedies left and right and left and right. And that's how Scary Movie came to be. And then because we got along so well, I became friends with the Wayans, and then they asked me to do White Chicks and Little Man and a bunch of other films. And by an accident again, I became frustrated with all the comedies, decided to do an action film called SWAT, which is a huge action film. And then when I was doing SWAT, I became profoundly depressed because I'm full of these little BOMOs this morning. One thing worse than not getting what you want is getting what you want. So on SWAT, I had 30 cameras. We were crashing airplanes into the 2nd Street Bridge. We lit half of East Los Angeles with these giant lights called Moscow lights. I had everything that I wanted, and I was profoundly depressed. And then a call came for a little independent in Florida that was about to shut down, and said, could you come and take over? We're in deep trouble. And I read the script, and I really liked it. the actress who I hadn't really heard of, but was on the phone with me, so Charlize something her name was, and it was her first real art film, and they asked me to come out again for no money, and I went. I left SWAT a little bit early, shot Monster, won an Oscar, became legendary, and that's way more information than you asked for.
That's amazing. I love that. That's sort of like the. I don't know. I don't even know what it is. Just that realization of, getting everything you want, and sort of that's the moment of almost like profound unhappiness. Or I guess it's because it's a trick that artists play on themselves a lot, I think, which is, if I just get here, if I just achieve this, if I just attain this, then I will be happy. Then my life will begin. And especially if you do get those moments sometimes, right, where you sort of turn out the gates of Paramount and everything. So you do get those brief moments of validation, but then it's like, but now what? It's like, I always think of the people that say, okay, I just want to win an Oscar. I just want to win an Oscar. It's like, but then the moment you do win one, now what? Are you going to go for your second one? Like, I think, whereas if the goal is less tangible and is more journey orientated, do you think that's sort of like a better psychology to have? Or do you think you still need those ambitions or that drive of trying to reach certain I don't know, benchmarks in your career? Do you still need that to propel you forward? I suppose there's that fear, isn't there? If you don't aim for those things, then you won't be driven enough, but maybe that's just an individual problem.
No, you're exactly right. I think that transition is one of the most important moments in your life, where you realize it's not about the validation of the capricious world. If you haven't seen it, or if your listeners haven't seen Jim Carrey's speech at the Golden Globes, where he said, "I'm Jim Carrey, who's won 2 Golden Globes, and I realized that I will never be truly happy and fully realized until I could say I'm Jim Carrey, who's won 3 Golden Globes." And he says it with profound irony, and everyone laughs in recognition, because ultimately, all the things you think that you want, I think, particularly to do with recognition or money or fame, all those things, and it's easy to say, I know, it sounds very privileged, that when you get them, it turns out to be of way less value than you think. But the idea of a journey of individual development as a person, intellectually, spiritually with a small s, I just mean about the idea that there's something more substantive in life than money, fame, and success. And a lot of it has to do with individual development. And then also, I think often, this will go very dark here, about people I've seen at the moment of death. And I'm always hoping that at that moment you look at their faces and there'll be a moment of epiphany, that suddenly they have been acquired the privilege to have an understanding of what this whole journey was about. But generally, they just look extremely frightened and confused. And so I think for all of us as people and as artists, we remain frightened and confused most of the time. And that's okay, because then the journey just becomes about individual development, sentient understanding, evolution as people, understanding that sometimes giving is better than receiving. Collaboration is actually more satisfying than individual success. All these other things that you are hard wrought, but learn through life experience, and have as many life experiences as you can, rather than focusing on the fame and success. And I've had films that made. Waterboy made $1 billion. I shot a film that won an Oscar, an ASC nomination. I'm not saying that out of pride, but kind of the sadness that none of those things made any great difference. But then when I began writing with more seriousness and earnestness, having some insight, some small insights into the human condition, and realizing that I came to those through bitter, failed life experiences, and not through the successes. That's made me understand better the journey that I'm on. Not that I've yet figured it out yet, but a better understanding than I had when I was 18.
Yeah. Do you remember what that moment was for you? Was it was it leaving the SWAT to go and do Monster? Was that a moment where you realized that stuff didn't matter as much, or was that sort of profound for a different reason?
It's going to sound very, self-important,
Not at all.
and humble bragging is humble bragging
Yeah,
expression
yeah,
used in the
yeah.
UK as well
Yeah,
as here. But
Yeah.
let me do a little moment of
yeah.
humble bragging. When you do the awards circuit, when you go to the Oscars, when you go to the Golden Globes, and I'll see how important and wonderful I am. You then look at it and you look around, and first of all, you're struck by how everybody is very much like you. They're prettier, maybe more famous, maybe richer, maybe, but they're still needy. They're still looking for approval. They're still confused. They're still lost. And then nothing transmogrifies magically when you win an award. There's a quiet satisfaction, and it's good for the career. You get more work in the future, but you don't essentially change. If you're unhappy going into the Golden Globes and you win a Golden Globe, turns out you're still unhappy 2 days
Yeah.
later. In fact, I would conjecture the saddest day of your lives very often is 2 days after an award ceremony or the day after a movie finishes. A profound ennui settles in on you that overwhelms, and I couldn't really always figure out what that is. But I think that these films and the award ceremonies are special because you have this sense of family for a moment,
Yeah.
that you don't feel quite so alone as you may normally feel, at least the way I normally feel. So when I do a film, the connection I have to everybody on the set becomes kind of magical. Sure, you argue. Sure, you disagree about your creative visions. Sure, the film may be diabolically awful. But at the end of it, you feel like a connection to other human beings. And you realize that sometimes you do your best work when you surrender to the will of others. You recognize your strengths and weaknesses. You understand how you can be facilitated, how you facilitate others. And when that's over, the quietude of the next day is overwhelming. And you realize that you need that in your life. Same thing with the award ceremony. When you get all these people together and you're all in this moment, which doesn't seem real. This is the odd thing. When you're at the Oscars, the Golden Globes, I wish I could say you have a sense of being there, but you don't feel you're there. You feel again that you're in a movie observing things that aren't wholly real. So you never can fully experience them. And everybody feels that. I mean, I've spoken to, movie stars who've actually come away with an Oscar or two, and they talk about the same thing that doesn't seem real or genuine. Oddly, the real and genuine experiences is the human interaction you have with other people at those award ceremonies in the breaks or getting a drink at the back afterwards. And you've all been on the same journey, and you all talk about the films you've worked on and what you're doing next, and how you realize that this is a temporary bit of ephemery, which will be there and then gone in a millisecond. So in a way means nothing at all, but your individual development means everything. Again, it sounds like a lot of
Yeah.
humble bragging and nonsense, but that's been my experience.
So would you say that the togetherness is the most kind of rewarding part of the creative process for you, or like what other parts of the creative process is rewarding to you?
I think that I've been writing a lot about the difference between consciousness and narrative. And there's a huge focus here in Hollywood on narrative, on storytelling. We say we're storytellers. And I've determined that we're not really storytellers. We use story, but story is a means to an end, not an end in itself. Anyone can tell a story, and the story may not be that interesting. The story may not be that significant. And it's also not the way that we as individuals experience the world. I wish we experience the world as a narrative. I woke up, I have a plan, I have an insuperable obstacle, I overcome that obstacle, I have a crisis, the stakes are increased, I overcome, that crisis,
Yeah.
I have a resolution, and there's an arc to my character that has changed over time. The way
Imagine if that happened every day. That would be exhausting.
it would be exhausting, incredibly boring. Exhausting and boring at the same time. Oh,
Yeah.
this is my a Super Bowl obstacle. I know will be overcome
Yeah.
in the next 90 minutes.
Even if it's just a toothpaste.
Unless I'm one of the characters that surprisingly dies in the third act. Exactly. Whereas with consciousness, I think Proust and others have taught us, and I think we should have been listening, that at any individual moment, we're remembering things that have passed, which are significant to us, emotional things, intellectual things. We imagine futures. We are shaping what we think our narrative is going to be, what our future is going to be. And we're experiencing things in the individual moment, but we're disassociative. So even as we're experiencing things, we're not wholly experiencing them. That's the real nature of consciousness. And what narrative is how we wish the world was. That there's a logic and a causality to it. If there's logic and causality, the world is safe. If you're virtuous, you're going to be rewarded. If there's malfeasance, they will be punished. If you set out for a destination, you will achieve that destination, but you got to overcome obstacles through individual growth. Wouldn't it be great if the world was like that, particularly if you look at the American political landscape right now? Wouldn't it be great if the virtuous were actually rewarded? Not getting into anyone's individual politics, but it's pretty mad here right now. But that's not the way the world is. So as artists, I wonder if we should use narrative and say, look, see, the world is ordered and structured, recognizing the audience desires structure, but probably won't experience it. Or should we, like Bruce did, or like Faulkner did, or other writers have done, or Charlie Kaufman does here as a screenwriter, relate our stories via our consciousness by this juxtaposition of these contradictory elements of memory, of imagination, and the experiential together. So that's how I view things, I think, slightly differently in that regard. I've gone off on some wild tangent, but probably haven't answered your questions remotely.
On that, I was wondering, so do you feel that films that are maybe more experimental or that differ from sort of the Hollywood model, do you think they're almost like more truthful in a way? Is that how you sort of see it, or?
I think they are. I think the important thing is the desire to embrace failure and iconoclasm. So I think that's essential for an artist. I think the desire to succeed makes people conservative, and then when you succeed, you become even more conservative. Because if you're in Hollywood and you do a film that makes a bunch of money or gets an award, they hire you because of that film. And then one of the first things they say is, do something like you just did, because we want to borrow from that success. And then, of course, now they're giving you things you never thought you would get, and you're buying things you never needed, and you're doing movies that you didn't want to pay for the things you never needed. And now you want to make sure that you don't rock the boat, and you start thinking, well, I better not experiment or do something dangerous, because then I might not get the gig that's giving me all this recognition and money. And then you no longer function as an evolving artist. So if instead you constantly, like David Bowie or someone like that, constantly reinventing yourself and thinking, I don't care what my past success was. My nature is to experiment, to discover a greater truth. So I can't say that all experimental films are better than conventional film, but I can say that all artists who experiment ultimately evolve to a better and more important place than those who quickly try to lean in to the thing that's given them success. When you stop changing, I think you stop being an artist, and I think that's a dangerous thing for a filmmaker. So I don't think you always have to do something that's radical and dangerous that may get you fired, but I do think that the minute you try to figure out what works, and then, for example, we do these things in Hollywood, test screenings, where you show your movie to this facilitator and these social scientists, and they tell you whether your film is working with an audience or not. And they bring in a test audience, and they survey them, and they ask them questions. This is so creatively stultifying. And then when producers talk to you about the audience and what the audience will like, and you try to anticipate what other people will like, you'll go mad, and you'll be compromised, and you'll do less good work, because you can never know another person's mind. And when it's thousands of minds, you can't know those minds, but you can know your own mind. And so if you make a film for yourself, as experimental, as radical, or as conventional as it may be, but if it's something that you believe in, ultimately it's going to be better than trying to please the great unwashed, the untold proletarian. So that's my view anyway.
Do you feel more responsibility to push the boat out and to be more experimental when it comes to your writing and directing more than cinematography? Or do you feel maybe that with cinematography you're having to serve a particular vision or like a director's vision in a way, or do you feel you can be creatively free on all these fronts?
There's a lot of directors out there that wish I had been serving their creative vision, but no, I was always taking huge risks. I was told when I first was learning about lighting that you have to light from above and three-quarter angle for the key light, and where the backlight should be, and where the fill light should be, and what the ratio would be. There'd be specific formulas that they would apply to the exposure ratio, and then I kind of ignored all that. I looked at the paintings of Renoir at one point, and then was struck by the fact that the lighting wasn't from above. It very often was from below. And then I looked at theater lighting, and I noticed that a lot of that lighting, particularly along the front of the stage, was from below. And I then looked at the construction of the face, and I thought, well, we've got these eyebrows and these noses, and they sort of show shadows, and we know that we've got to light the eyes. It's the fill lights for, theoretically. What if we put the key light from below? So I became obsessed with this, and I went through a whole period of about 7 or 8 years where my light was always from below. I would put white sheets on the floor and bounce all the light from below, and everything would be illuminated from below. I'd have some fill light above, but everything else came from below, and it looked painterly and magnificent. And the interesting thing was, no one could recognize where the key source was from. It seemed as if the characters were iridescing from within, and on music videos and then on feature films, and a lot of feature films this way, it looked spectacularly, only because I violated the orthodoxy, and I felt the license to do that. And I thought that was significant and important. I was lighting from intuition and understanding rather than being told the rules for lighting. Writing, the same thing. It wasn't until I abandoned the 3 acts or the 5 acts and really began writing intuitively. Again, one thing I do, I've stopped using computer. I've started using Final Draft. I dictate all my scripts, and I write them very quickly without an outline, without an order, without a structure. All I do is dialogue. I will go for a walk. I will record characters talking about themselves, about their backstory in particular. And then I will come back, transcribe it, and then read what I wrote. The last feature script I wrote in 2 days. I got to tell you, it was terrible because I wrote it in 2 days. But then I went back. And I read what I wrote. And exactly. And I would change and alter. And there's a reason why this works so successfully, particularly on the book, the book that I wrote, GRQ, which I wrote in a day. And that has now had the greatest success creatively of anything I've done in 20 years. And people say it's the best thing I've written. I wrote it very, very quickly and wholly intuitively without a plan, only focusing on dialogue, and discovered, most importantly, character. Because there's so much emphasis on education, on structure and narrative, everybody does their story first. And then when their characters speak, it plugs into narrative. So that the character says, I've got this terrible problem. Obviously the exposition setting up the conflict or the obstacle that's to come. The character's not speaking from their own eccentricities, their predispositions, their obsessions. They're talking to serve narrative. When I say to my students or to the people I mentor, people who work for me as assistants, who sometimes give me samples of the scripts, I say, tell me your story. They can speak for hours about their story. I say, tell me about your character. Maybe 30 seconds about character. And yet, as pattern-seeking creatures, as humans, we're passively interested in narrative, but we're really interested in character. When we go out each morning and day, we meet people, we're trying to figure people out all the time. We spend our lives trying to figure out our partners or our family members or people we meet. That's what we're interested in. They can tell us any story that they want. When we go to buy a car, we hear the buy this car narrative, but we don't trust narrative. Because we understand it's an imposition on the reality of consciousness. What we really want to know is the character of that person selling us the car. Are they truth tellers or not? And that way, therefore, we ignore narrative and we look for other signals or indicators. So in that way, with both the book and with my films, I had a different way of writing, without outline, without plan, without narrative. And then I would go back to a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth draft, and then I would impose narrative, but it would naturally evolve from an understanding of character. Then my characters were complex. They were inconsistent. They would talk about things that had nothing to do with the story. Now you think, what a waste. He was supposed to write with autonomy. But it's not a waste, because then the audience sees an authenticity to that character. They say, oh, that's just like people in real life. That's just like our own mediation of our lives. Now we recognize complex characters focused on many different things, not only the narrative through line. And then the story seems more genuine. You guys have Mike Leigh in the UK. And here's a great example of a film like Happy Go Lucky or Topsy Turvy or Meantime or Naked, about the evolution of characters that have nothing to do with the ultimate narrative, but everything to do with creating complexity of character that seems genuine and real and therefore authentic and therefore has a greater impact on audience.
Do you find that being a novel writer as well helps you to be more character driven in your writing?
Yeah, I love the great thing is the juxtaposition of the different stages of my unplanned career. Having been a cinematographer makes me a better writer, because I love those moments of enigmatic encoding. So when you have a photographic image of someone right now, light coming on my face, and if I was just silent and staring at the window, and you held that shot for an inordinate amount of time, and maybe even pushed the camera in slowly, the audience would sense that there's something there and it means something, but they wouldn't be entirely sure what it meant. And that's that complex enigma that I'm talking about. That the photographic image, cinematography, can create meanings. It's a language. You've got to think of cinematography as a language to fully utilize it, but it's a language with uncertainty. Like painting can be uncertainty. You look at Carl Caspar Hauser, Carl Caspar rather. You look at abstract expressionism. These things create meanings, but the meanings are enigmatic and uncertain, and there's a power in that. And that's one of the powers of motion pictures, is you can have those moments of enigma because it replicates the way we mediate the world. We look at things and we don't always understand the meaning of them. We're opposite someone we love or we think we're falling in love with, and they look at us and they don't say anything. Are we examining their faces, looking for meaning when they don't speak? You ask someone, do you love me? And they look at you and they're expressionless. That moment summarizes and distills the nature of great cinematography, because you're looking for meaning and you're not certain of what that meaning is. Now, in writing, the great pleasure of writing a novel is writing that backstory and examine the real nature of consciousness and our self-narrative, our interior lives, that I can't do when I'm creating a photographic image. And I can't even do in a feature screenplay, because I've got 90 minutes or 2 hours to tell a story or create or elicit emotions in an audience. And sadly, I can't get into the depth that I want to get into when I'm writing a novel. In the novel, it's entirely written from characters' points of view. They're all unreliable narrators. Guy, in this case, it lies to his wife, says everything's fine, their house is about to be repossessed. So he decides to invest everything he has, everything he can get, in crypto, while Los Angeles is having an earthquake. And everything's told from his narrative as he begins to lie to everybody to try to get this money to save himself. Now, I got an opportunity to examine that consciousness in great detail that I couldn't have done as easily in a film, although subsequently I made it into a movie. It's quite interesting to see GRQ the book and GRQ the movie. They're related to each other, but they're whole different experiences. One is an examination of the interior life of a character. One is full of these enigmatic uncertainties as you try to look at behavior and judge it, not fully knowing what his delusional narrative is, and what's real and what isn't. In the book, you see what he's thinking, but again, his thinking isn't clear. Two entirely different experiences, two different medium. That's why I'm glad my life has been this chaos, because it allows me to use different art forms, because every form serves as its artist in different ways.
Does each form, I'm trying to think of the right word, bring you like a different kind of joy? Do you find each one satisfying in a different way as well?
Yeah, I mean, I loved, it was great being a cinematographer for lots of different reasons. One, for that way that you can express yourself, which is you can create beautiful or evocative images. It's a very interesting part of your development when you stop showing off. That came later in my life than it should have. We're still all looking for approval or recognition all the time. So as a cinematographer, you create stunningly beautiful images because you get that positive reinforcement. You say, that's great. But sometimes stunningly beautiful is inappropriate. So when I shot Monster, and Charlize is a stunningly beautiful person. And I worked very hard to make her as unattractive as I possibly could. We used green, blue lighting. We
Yeah.
used side lighting, which is never an attractive lighting. We used a handheld camera. I underexposed the film and then printed up to give it a rough, grainy quality. What I had learned was that better to do an appropriate cinematography than one that is beautiful. And the same thing with every other craft that you work in. Learning what is appropriate sometimes is better than what is best. So you change your way of thinking.
Yeah. I was thinking about the underlighting you were talking about as well, just in terms of the cinematography. Did you vary it depending on the genre you were in? Was that sort of like a starting point of like, this is how I like to make my characters pop on screen, but I'm going to alter my methodology depending on the situation or the film or the genre?
Yeah, you're always looking to two purposes. You want to do what's appropriate. And you recognize that you alter what you do for the appropriateness of the individual moment. But at the same time, you discover through experimentation and being iconoclast and being radical new ways of approaching things. So sometimes you think, well, this is a tool. It's part of my toolkit. I can now utilize this, and I know that underlighting will create an emotive response in an audience that conventional lighting doesn't. The same thing with the way I write a screenplay. I discovered early on my writing, I'd want to, again, show off what a clever writer I was. And I'd write at great length these long speeches, which read beautifully, but would stop the narrative in its tracks. And then I became really interested in extreme economy of writing, where my characters would say virtually nothing at all. And now both I use when appropriate. You acquire these tools by experimenting with them, find out how they work, and you only acquire tools by doing that experimentation. It would be great if you knew everything beforehand, but you don't. And you have to do to figure it out, and you have to fail to really figure it out, because then you have to examine the nature of the failure and why it happened. You have to embrace the chaos, as I say, and you have to be in love with failure.
What would your advice be to people that are maybe trying to find themselves as a writer, for instance? Should they be writing a certain amount every day? Like, is there a practical guide that you maybe suggest to people? If you write X amount every day, or aim to achieve this amount per year, certainly in your early days, that's going to put you in a good position so that you understand these different tools that are available, like underwriting and overwriting.
Hugely important question. Absolutely. The world is, to my mind, utter chaos, and we impose narrative on it. That the world will not give you a discipline, but the most valuable tool you can have is self-discipline. So this idea of stoicism, that the world will be as the world is, you can't change that or affect it, mostly, but you can alter yourself. And to my mind, what happiness I've wrought comes from self-discipline. So every morning, 7 days a week, 5 a.m., genuinely, I'm up and writing. Now, the reason I can do that is because I'm writing crap. I mean, I'm writing terribly, because I accept the failure before I even start the day. If I had to wake up every single day and write well, I would go mad. But if I know that I wake up, that it's like writing emails. I'm not writing emails, by the way. Do not write emails during my writing time. The email is off. But just writing, then without an outline, I don't have anything to achieve. I'm just getting words down. It's magical, and it's transmogrifying. I learned so much about myself. It's my therapy that as I write characters, I get insight into my failings and peculiarities and predispositions and obsessions and all that through my writing. And I'll write for 3.5, 4 hours, take a short break, and then another 3 or 4 hours, and then my day is done. Then the gym and meditations and all that other LA kind of stuff. But that morning, as sacrosanct, I have to start every single day like that. And it's not hard. It's not hard if you're not thinking that you have to write great stuff, if you're not worried about audience, if you're not worried about pleasing people, if you're not thinking, I'm going to write this, I'm going to give it to my tutors, to my friends, and they're going to read it. Don't do that. Write badly as often as you possibly can, but most importantly, self-discipline. Same thing with set life. If you had an opportunity to work on a set, your career will be very brief if you're cruel, self-important, angry, raise your voice, if you don't learn how to apologize. These seem simple, small things, but character matters profoundly when you're collaborating with others. If one lesson you learn as a director is you can't even tell a small lie. If you were to say to an actor on a take, "Oh, that was fantastic, love. Now let's just do another one," and she senses, or he senses, or whoever the actors are speaking to, that you're blowing smoke, flannel, whatever it is, and that it isn't true, then later when they do something great but risky and you say it was great, they're not going to believe you. So you have to practice this idea of radical honesty, of never telling even a small lie. You've got to tell the crew and the producers and everyone you work with the absolute unequivocal truth. That's really hard. When you make a mistake and you insult somebody, a lot of times in relationships as well, just ignore it, it'll go away. But you've got to be formalized in your, again, self-discipline, and take a person aside on a film set that you've insulted and say, "I'm sorry. I know what I did wrong. I know why it happened. And here's my strategy. Make sure it doesn't happen again." That sounds nonsensical, but if you practice that, you unify your crew. It's good leadership, and it makes your film more successful. Leadership, hugely important, and the idea of discipline. Recognizing whether people do good work and saying it out loud, and then talk about your own vulnerabilities. I talk all the time on film sets. Usually the first day of a shoot, bring the crew together and I say, "These are the things I'm frightened of. These are my weaknesses. This is where I might fail. I need your help." So the idea of individual self-discipline, of having a character-driven methodology, these are the secrets for success. Forget everything else, all the technical stuff. Forget all the recognition and the nonsense and the self-selling. Selling is always narrative. The minute you start selling, you're going to fail because people aren't going to trust you. But self-discipline, kindness, self-awareness, the ability to apologize, always being on time. Worked in films for 50 years. I've never been late to a set once. It's not hard not to be late, to use a double negative. But, it's traffic, this happened. Right away, people say low character. And they think there's a 50-50 chance that you're lying when you say why you were late. The rule in Hollywood is 30 minutes early is on time. An hour early is practical, and 90 minutes shows good professional discipline. So aim to be 30 to 40 minutes to an hour early. If you're never late and you hit traffic, you're still going to get there on time. And then people say reliable, apologizes, character-driven, hardworking, and you've cured half the problem of what stops people from getting work. But most of all, individual discipline of writing every day, and don't let the great be the enemy of the good. Do something always to keep moving forward. And then iconoclasm, always experimenting.
Yeah. With the sort of discipline, how do you have any tips or tricks of sitting down and working? Because I mean, personally, there's good days and bad days, I think, right? There's some days where it's just you wake up and it's all just flowing out, but it's always the bad days that then sort of can throw you off and interrupt that flow, which could have been building for a few days. But do you have any things that you've learned over the years that you're like, if I just do this without fail, I'll definitely start writing within a minute or so?
That the sense of don't try to write well, and don't write to an outline. If you've got an outline and you feel you got to write well, you're not going to write. It's really hard. I've got to fit this into this. Or if you start with a structure, if you've read Save the Cat, I don't know. You guys may use it as a textbook. I hope they have not reading Save the Cat. So you can cut this part out if you want. But then you think, oh my God, by page 10, I've got to achieve this. And now you're on page 8. You're going to spend hours trying to figure out how to shoehorn that information into the next 2 pages. But if you just write about whatever you write, when I wrote the novel GRQ, the first draft, I had a character speak for 45 pages, just about the nature of his relationship with his wife. and how
Wow.
what he didn't like about her. And then as he thought about it, what he realized that she didn't like about him, and then ultimately what he had to change, and then ultimately what he couldn't change, and then the inevitable nature that their relationship was always going to be what it was going to do. Did that all get in the book? No. It was distilled down to 4 lines. 4 lines ultimately.
Really?
But that's not where it started. Where it started was my discovery of that person. And it was so much bloody fun. It was so much fun
Yeah.
to just have this character speak and be self-delusional. And it was joyful, and I had no obligations. I was just writing someone talking who didn't recognize who he was. It was joyful and fun. And so I look forward every morning to writing because I can write whatever I want because there's no
Yeah,
order,
yeah.
discipline. I never let the great be the enemy of the good. And then is always the discovery. The faster I write, the faster I dictate. Whenever I hit a block, I talk faster, as you guys have probably noticed,
Yeah, yeah.
and faster, getting more and more and more words down. And then I'll just start speaking nonsense sometimes, or start speaking poetry or in free verse. And then when I look back, there's something there that I can extract and distill, sometimes down to 4 lines. And when I do that and it becomes a joyful practice, you can't fail. It's the desire to succeed that destroys our ability to succeed. It's the attempt at greatness that prevents us from being great. It's the belief that there's already an order in place that we have to learn rather than discovering our own order. Our belief that there's a truth out there that we have to access that prevents us from knowing our own truth. It's easy if you simply stop in embracing the structure, rules, and orthodoxies that limit you from evolving as a person, as an artist.
And I think following on from that, talking about writing 45 pages of dialogue from one character, that's such a good technique to sort of get to know your character, because then you know what you want to say when you're going to write just those 4 lines. You have all the information there. And I was wondering, like, do you have any other techniques in which you get to know your characters, sort of for young writers?
Yeah. Line is hugely important. My 2 obsessions are truth and line. As a practice, we should tell the truth. Our characters should always lie. People lie about what's important to them. They don't lie about what isn't important. Lie is such a big threshold to go over for most people that when a character lies, you reveal so much about that character's nature. And if the audience, the reader, is in a position of privilege and they see that character lie, then they say something's happening here in their subconscious or unconscious that's to do with why they have to tell this lie. They're frightened of something. They have some need. They're trying to achieve something. So lying is a hugely valuable method to get to the nature of character. I also think that the mistake that most writers come to deal with is laziness. And I don't mean laziness in not getting up and writing. I mean that when offered the opportunity of writing a 2-hander, or as opposed to a 3-hander, we'll always choose the 2-hander because we just have 2 characters speaking and it's simple. But there's no dynamic to that. And it changes the complexity and nature of character. When you have 3 people, something magically changes. The person speaking is speaking to 2 people, which means that they're serving 2 different agendas. They're trying to please one and maybe trying to insult another. They're trying to please both. They're telling the truth to one that may offend another. The dynamic becomes much more interesting, and the dialogue becomes much more interesting because now you have 3 people with 3 different agendas, 4 agendas, 5 agendas, all competing with each other, and the dynamic becomes much bigger. Why don't we write that way? We don't write that way because it's harder to write that way. But it's so much more fun, and you learn so much more about character than 4 characters, 5 characters. When you write a 6-hander, it is so joyful, and the dynamic that's going on, because you have all these different elements that are happening. People speaking, sometimes people quietly listening, someone throwing a look in judgment, and going back to that idea of the enigma of the image, and in the middle of your dialogue, family and child says something, and you say in your script, the father simply looked at her. Now, at that moment, there's some enigmatic meaning, but you don't know what it's just a look. So you've got the father with the enigma, you've got the girl talking about the date she just had with a person the father didn't approve of and going at great length. You have the brother saying some subtext about the nature of the sister, but really he's jealous. What great dynamics! And then, as the audience reads this or observes it in the film, they become engaged. And as they become engaged, they begin examining the film text to discover character. So essential, add characters, have them lie as often as you frequently can, put the audience in a position of privilege, all of great value. And then the idea of parallel narratives, going back to this idea of consciousness as opposed to narrative. Think about how the mind works. If you think entirely in narrative, bless you, you're a very special person and your life is very simple and will always be good. But I don't know anyone who thinks that way. We live in the world of memory and regret very often, of maybe joyful, bittersweet memories, the ennui I mentioned before, and most of all, an imagination, imposing our will on the world as we want it to be. Well, why not write characters that way? Why not, talk about their imagination, their misperceptions, have them not lie but make mistakes based on the desire, how they perceive things, not as things are, but as they wish they would be. Doesn't that give you insight to character? The secret of, again, I'm going to drop names in my humble bragging. Very important to me. You can all validate me. My friend Jon Favreau, did film, did the first of the Marvel franchise. He did, it's a great sentence. He did, Iron Man with Robert Downey. And Robert and John did an improvisation where Robert Downey shows this very neurotic, very needy individual. And then the Iron Man, the rest of the stuff happens. That opening 5 minutes, I think, established the whole franchise. Why? Because what people are actually interested in is not core competencies like every superhero has, but core vulnerabilities. Because we want a human connection. When we see a person on screen or in a book that's full of weaknesses, inconsistencies, vulnerabilities, and failures, we relate to them because in our secret narrative about ourselves, we feel vulnerable, weak, and flawed as they are. When a person is competent in all things, we admire it like we admire narrative, because in our imagination, we wish we had those core competencies and could triumph over all obstacles. So in a sense, vicariously, we enjoy superheroes because they have skill sets that we don't. But we don't relate to superheroes except in their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses. So when you create vulnerabilities in a character, immediately that is something the audience shares, and they go on that character's journey because you've shown that character as being human as they are. Why AI can't replace writers? Because AI can imitate the human experience, but what people want is the genuine human experience. We want to know what another person, the artist, the writer, the filmmaker, thinks and feels, so we can think and feel those things vicariously, and AI can't do that. So vulnerabilities, inconsistencies, you put the audience in a position of privilege, have a character lie, add more characters to scenes. All these things are tricks, but I think significant in our evolution as artists because it makes us work harder in some way, but also it's a lot more fun to write.
Have you spoken to John about sort of these ideas and stuff? Because obviously I was thinking about the whole Marvel Disney machine. If I think about the most structured or the most Hollywood template films, I feel like you could point at sort of like your Disney films that feel like they're almost structure first. Although I know that Pixar's model of doing that is actually very interesting and impressive because they actually just rewrite and rewrite and rewrite until it ends up almost finding that structural shape, and that's how they get it working so well. So it feels like they're actually intending to be more free. But yeah, have you spoken, obviously, working in the studio system, how do you balance that sort of character versus...
We've all talked about this and thought it's significant. John, of course, came out of Second City, which was by no accident, an improv company out of Chicago, and was an actor first on Rudy and others, and so very much was inclined in that direction. The reason he did Chef was in part his frustration with the studio system was he wanted to find an individual expression that didn't fit into a formula. Because of course, once John was successful with Iron Man, then they wanted to do the same films over and over again. Marvel found a formula, and they kept doing the same formula over and over again, so making money. And Pixar is the best, worst, whichever we want to look at it. They have a very, very specific what they think scientific formula as all their scripts are do. I mean, they follow a very specific structure, and it works for them to a certain degree. How satisfying it is for the people who work at Pixar, I'm not going to name names, is not a joyful experience. It is a factory, and if you want to get the film to work in a factory, then Pixar might be the place you want to go. No disrespect to Pixar, because for the people that see Pixar films, they are hugely successful, and the films do work to a certain degree. I would think that, in my mind, the reason they work is the actors they bring in, the characters they evolve. Whatever their narrative is sort of tired, but the everything else is so strong that those very excellent Pixar films remain excellent. There's a very important experiment I should tell you about that they did about 6 years ago in Hollywood. Is they brought in audiences to a theater and they showed them the first 10 minutes of a movie. And then they stopped the movie and they asked the audience to write how the film might end, how they thought it would end. And 93% of that audience predicted the ending after watching 10 minutes of the movie. 93%.
That's crazy.
Now, and they did it again with another movie. They did it again with another movie, another. All those films use the 3-act, the inciting incidents, the page 50 turn, all that thing. And audiences got to the point where they could pull. Now, if you want to go to a movie and you know, as you're watching after 10 minutes, if you're home flipping through streamers, you probably find the same thing after 10 minutes. The film on Netflix, I think it's number one on Netflix right now, which we could barely watch 5 minutes of. But after watching 2.5 minutes, we knew exactly where the film was going to go. I think that's tragic. And I think, again, it doesn't go to our nature as audience or as observers, in that we want to have new experience. The reason Juno was such a magical film was you had no idea where it was going to go. You had no idea who these characters were. They spoke in an argot, in a vernacular that was unique as well. Everything about it was fresh, but was full of life and uncertainty. But when you watch a film and you know where it's going after 10 minutes, I think, unless you're, 7 years old, that isn't going to give you as much joy as a film that has a less predefined and predetermined structure and order.
Just before we sort of head towards our last couple of questions that we always ask everyone, I'm excited to hear your response. But just lastly, on this sort of like story and this sort of contrast between, letting the story be what it should be versus, I don't know, the imposed structural system. Do you have any advice on, one, which structural elements you still find useful? Like, do you still find it useful to try and find your midpoint, even if you're trying to write in a more free-spirited way? And then are there any other structural moments like the midpoint or like the break into Act 2 that you do try and hit? And secondly, how would you try and get a film that is slightly more creatively free made? Because I feel like there's almost an expectation that when you hand over your spec script these days, that it has that sort of predictability, which maybe it makes the studio heads feel more happy with themselves that they know where it's going. But yeah, I don't know. What's your advice to fight against? / what bits do you like using?
Smart question. First of all, you're absolutely right. I should forewarn everybody that it's a fear-driven, and I hate to use the word, and I can't believe I'm about to use this word, industry, because it's a creative art, but they call it industry. The studios are terrified. Everyone at the studio lives in fear. They drive Porsches and they wear nice suits, but they all live in fear. And they live in fear of losing their jobs. So the way they make decisions is this. If they hire somebody, or they commission a script that follows convention, or hire somebody who's already had success, and that project they hired them for fails, they won't get fired, because the person immediately above them goes, oh, that person you hired, that script, which I would have commissioned that script, and I would have hired that person. So if it's a conventional 3-act script, and it's delivered, and that's commissioned, everybody feels safe, because it's the structure that everyone in Hollywood or in the industry accepts. So right away, you're up against it if you don't follow that order and structure. I'm telling you that you'll write a better script if you don't follow the structure, but you're definitely up against it. So that's something to consider. I'm not going to say it's easy. If being Charlie Kaufman is not easy, but Charlie Kaufman's achieved some success and some really original material. Being Mike Lee isn't easy, but he's had some considerable success. As for the mechanisms and devices I use from the conventional narrative structure, I use most of them in the end. The trick is not to start there. It doesn't mean that you don't use them. But when you're doing your initial bit of imagination, if you're writing into a form, you're going to limit your evolution of character, your development of the backstory that's essential. I use backstory for everything. When I worked with John Malkovich, humble bragging again, on Dominion, Last Call as it's called, I gave John 200 pages of backstory on his character. Had nothing to do with the script, nothing to do with any of the dialogue, but just so he would know who that character was. And then he came back to me with, I think, even more pages about how he felt about the character. And then we worked together and forged this backstory, which never appears in the film. But I would say that we did 4 or 5 improvisational scenes, and we drew on that backstory to develop that character. And the character in that film was absolutely magical, because of that.
Yeah.
I would also say that certain devices simply work because they really happen in life. The idea of an inciting incident, I think that there's a validity to that. I don't think it has to come by a particular page, but Hitchcock said that filmmaking is like life with all the boring parts cut out. And I do think that all film is about a moment of change, either in a character or an event. So there's nothing wrong with having some significant event happen, which then drives the narrative forward. If you're just having characters talk and do nothing else, I don't think that's going to be hugely engaging for an audience. So an inciting incident, I think, is of value. I do think that films should be about change. So I do think it's important that your characters have arcs. So you should lay out your arcs eventually after you've discovered character through the exercise I've talked about, then lay out about where that character is going to get to and where they start from. I think that's entirely valuable. I do think that things change. And to really discover character can be revealed. You may know who the character is because you live in this exercise, but to reveal it to an audience, I think having a turn is a significant thing because there's a term that I use often about life and about Hollywood and about myself called the momentum of mediocrity. Is that once you have some level of success or once you start doing something, it's much harder to change than to keep doing it. So I hired an agent once who was a terrible agent, but I knew them and liked them. So I kept the agent because it was the momentum of mediocrity. I started doing comedies, and I didn't like doing them that much, although I liked doing some of them, but not all of them. But I kept doing them because it was easier. It was only when I forced myself to change that my life became better, but change is hard. So incorporating a turn or a change in a script where events suddenly go a different direction, I think hugely valuable. So I'm not advocating against any of these things. I'm just saying don't start there. Because you start there, so often what we call high concept scripts, where people have a great idea for a script and they'll tell you enthusiastically and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. That's narrative. When people say, I want to make a film about a really interesting group of people, and I don't know what the story is going to be, then I know they're onto something. Then they do my exercise where they create character, they get a highly evolved character, they write at great length with all this dialogue, not worrying about narrative, and then they use narrative devices as a last resort or as a finishing point, and they impose that on the film. And now you plug these characters into, or you plug the narrative into the characters rather than the characters in the narrative, and you end up writing a much better script. So I'm not advocating against structure and order. I'm just saying if you start there, that way lies madness. And the idea of getting up and writing for 2 hours when you got to write to a structure, you're going to say, I'm just going to lay in bed for another half hour. I'll write twice as amount tomorrow. All those lies that we tell ourselves. But if you're just writing joyfully about a character speaking, you can do that. And once you know character, believe me, writing the narrative is so much easier.
Yeah, it's amazing. So our last 2 questions, our question we ask everyone, is what were you up to during your teenage years that turned out to be helpful for what you do now? And what advice would you give to that teenage version of yourself?
Wow, the radical honesty becomes difficult at this point. I was a mess as a teenager. I was self-destructive and depressed and dangerous and hurting many people, most of all myself. So I'm not being prescriptive, but that's what I was about. I had no idea. I was deeply unhappy and blaming everybody else in the world for my unhappiness, I guess. searching for experiences, so experimenting with everything dangerously, and doing lots of really bad things, and shouldn't have survived. So I don't recommend that for anybody. The remedy that followed was more significant, which is when I began writing, not just for audience, but really just for myself, where I began to examine myself. Whereas when I began to take the idea of self-discovery as something important, as a job, I began to heal myself. I began to look at my obsessions and dangerous behaviors and antisocial stuff that I was doing as a symptom of something that lied deeper and underneath. Sure, there was psychoanalysis and therapy, which I recommend for everybody, even those who weren't as crazy as I was, because as artists, you have to discover your own nature. And that's a really hard thing to do. The hardest thing to overcome is not the world, but yourself, because the self lies to you all the time, and you want to blame the world for your maladies. And you shouldn't do that. You have to look at yourself constantly as an artist and work out how you can evolve, come to a better understanding, not just about making more money or greater success, but discovering your own individual voice. And then recognizing that for all the dangerous things I did, the idea of experimentation in life is not a bad thing, providing it's not nearly fatal. So having lots of different careers has what made me what I am now. The book, GRQ, which is the best thing I've ever written, I could not have written at 18. I could not have written at 25. It's only because I've had those bad experiences, because I knew people, and because I myself have been desperate for money. I couldn't write about a person lying if I haven't told lies in my life. I couldn't write about a failed relationship if I didn't have failed relationships. Same, go off and sabotage your relationships or lie to people. But when you've had those experiences and you go back and examine the consequences, then you can provide real insight into other people. People want to know what artists say because we want other people experimenting with the lives that we're not living. So when an artist has lived a lot of complex lives and lots of experience and can write honestly about them, because then once you put pen to paper or dictate or type, then you've got to speak honestly about your own nature, then that's of value. Then you're providing a guide for others beginning their lives or living their lives as alternate avenues to their own experiences. And that's of great value. So I guess I'm not advising to do what I was doing with 18. Was not a good antecedent for the life that followed. But my remedy to my experiences then were of value. And look, I keep mentioning the book because the book was a seminal spiritual experience for me. It was so satisfying to write that book. And I could draw on the experience of cinematography, of directing, of writing, of the labor, of the failures I've had, of the relationships I've had. And I could speak to that about all those things. And I think that it was successful, not because of the marketing, not because of the association with the film, not because I may be the world's greatest writer, but I spoke truthfully about my own experiences of life. And I think that is essential. So if that's a kind of a recommendation as to what I would do, that's the recommendation. I probably went off again on some wild tangent, but I hope I at least obliquely answered your question.
Not at all, not at all. Honestly, this has been so amazing and such useful practical insight in terms of writing creative character and also how that applies to all these other fields. So yeah, it's honestly been amazing. Where can people go to if people do want to read the book or find your other works? Where should they look?
GRQ was actually published by British publishers, so it's all over the UK. It's in Waterstones and it's on Amazon, and it's kind of all good bookstores. I think this is personally they commonly use. Talk about moments of validation for me, who lived in England for so long, to go into Foyles and find my book on a shelf there. And what I did, this is how pathetic I am. I am pathetic. I took the book out. I was just you just see the spine. So I took it out and I turned it frontwards.
Yeah.
So, and just so people would see it. And like every bookstore I've been to in London, I do the same tragic, pathetic thing. But
no, that's amazing.
yeah, but it's certainly on Amazon and elsewhere. It's called GRQ, and you can get it. So thanks very much. As you guys know, I've got on Instagram. I do little stuff, things like this every day, which is my giving back to all the people. So I like Steven Bernstein, director, writer, and of course I do the podcast Filmmaker and Friends with Filmmaker and Fans, which with Vince Grimes. She used to be the creative director of Google. And an interesting fellow, and we talk about creative process each day. So that's where you can find me. And then the film GRQ comes out the beginning of next year. So all those things.
I could talk about story and character till the cows come home. In fact, I could talk after the cows have already come home. I could carry on talking about story and character and structure. And I like what he was saying about just not being inhibited by any of these expectations. When you're being creative, just be creative. Just allow yourself to be free.
Yeah.
I also just love hearing about people's routines, because I struggle so much to just sit down and write sometimes.
Yeah.
It can be painful.
I think the core of what he was saying was about experimentation and not being afraid of failure, but at the same time not being driven by quote unquote success, and just sort of finding a freedom and a flow in what you're creating or writing, which can sometimes be inhibited by things like aspirations and sort of imposed structure. But also it was really interesting to have that sort of conversation discussion at the end about how those things are still useful and how you do need to bring them on board sometimes, and it's more about where you start from and what you use as a starting point, and because I just think it, for writers, it's such a sort of, there's a common feeling of being torn between like going off and not planning and being free, and then also sort of having maybe like studio demands or production demands, or just a general kind of expectation to fill like structural sort of expectations. And it was just, we could have spoken about it for ages, and I think we could have spoken about so many different parts of Steve's career and his sort of fields that he's worked in. We could have gone on for hours and hours about loads of different parts, but it was great to land on writing.
I was gonna say I wanted to pick his brains as well about the white chick scene. Making my way downtown, walking fast, and just being like, what was that like, being on set for that moment,
and also like when he was sort of speaking about lighting and being experimental, I was like, I wonder what experiments he did on white chicks.
Absolutely. I mean, that film looks super fun to be involved in and to film as well, and that's really interesting as well. But underlighting, it's genuinely no one underlights that I'm aware of, so to hear that was like his primary method of lighting characters for a period of time is actually like slightly mind-boggling. But I think again it all comes down to that, like, to his philosophy of experimentation, of pushing the boat out. And I genuinely was expecting him to say that, I don't know, experimenting is for directors and writers, but as a cinematographer it's about just sort of bringing that vision to life. But instead it was like, no, the experimentation happens there as well. It's like you're constantly creatively pushing yourself and pushing the boat out, and that's what is going to give you exciting results. That's what's going to keep the art form moving forward, despite the expectations of Hollywood. It's like, so you've got to be creative and free and stuff. And to be honest, when I see a film that's different and unconventional at the cinema, I'm so much more grateful. Even if it didn't work, I'm grateful that film got made. I'm grateful that it went to the cinemas. I'm grateful that I got to see it in the cinema. Like, there are some, like, Ari Aster's films are all slightly quirky structurally. Well, actually, you could argue they're all pretty, like, I don't know, structured or follow that structure, but I think that they have a freedom to them, and a looseness certainly in terms of pacing as well, which I think is like really interesting. And I think there's lots of films like that.
I also think that you have to know what the rules are in order to break them sometimes as well. Like striking a balance of sort of satisfying audiences with what they're expecting from like the genre, but also surprising them. And I feel like skillfully kind of surprising someone and going against like the grain comes from knowing what the grain is. And I
always think that all of these tools are essentially, my favorite phrase is they're lenses to look at your story through, right? And it could be that you're going to put on a pair of glasses, so you're going to analyze your film from the perspective of let's say you're writing a horror, like how are all the horror sequences, and that's just a pair of goggles that you're going to put on to analyze the script. Then you're going to see as your character's doing all the right things. Okay, but what about this structural model in my head, the 5-act structure? Does it line up with that? Is that going to tell me about certain passages of the film that actually are struggling and are not behaving very well? You know, and then you can also do the same thing for other structural models. There's a great like pyramid type structure shape that you might be familiar with, Ellen, which is the idea of escalating action and then de-escalating action after your midpoint. And again, that is a great thing, a great lens to look at your script through. All these things are tools to help you improve your film. But when you build it to begin with, maybe don't let the structure write your film. I think is an interesting and I think helpful philosophy.
There's no blueprint. Like as you say, there's many sort of story structure theories or sort of techniques to go by, and I think Steve would agree that one of the worst things you can do as sort of a writer early on is to hold your work against one of those and think that it's wrong because it doesn't fit it exactly. But it's ways to see what's missing in your story or what other directions you could take it. But yeah, here we go again, Dan, down the rabbit hole of story.
We're back down it. That's what I'm saying. That's our interest was peaks, and we couldn't help it. We're now falling into the. It's like I feel like one of those coins going round the spinny thing before eventually falling down the hole in the middle. What are they called? Do you remember those things? What are they called?
No, I can see it in my head, but I can't see what it's called. It almost seems like one of those things that doesn't actually exist. It's just a figment of my like childhood memory.
Yeah, I know what you mean. A bit like that Dreamcore stuff. I'm obsessed with Dreamcore on Instagram. I don't know if you're familiar. If you just type in Dreamcore on Instagram, it's all like things that feel like they're images you saw from your childhood, and but they're all things that places that don't make sense. It'll be like a play pit, but beyond the play pit is just green fields that just go on as far as the eye can see. So it's all familiar images that are like in landscapes that don't make sense. So it might be like a play pit actually that goes on forever and stuff, you know?
Right, yeah.
Ellen, I've got a question.
Yes, hit me, Dan.
This question is from Jacob. Jacob says, I've just got on my camera. What would you recommend focusing on learning first? Lighting, composition, or just storytelling? Which I think is pretty thematic for this episode. What do you reckon, Ellen?
So I don't have a cinematography background, so I'm going to flip the question background to you, and I'm going to sort of add expertise where I can, because I think I would say start with storytelling, because I think every aspect of filmmaking is storytelling, whatever role you're doing. And that will help you in whatever role you're doing. But yeah, Dan, take it away.
No, I think, what are you doing if you're not telling a story? So I think all of these things are storytelling in many ways. although Stephen obviously say that all of these things are perhaps more than storytelling, and they're actually about creating a visceral, emotional experience. So I'm trying to give you an answer that's in light of what we've been listening to, but ultimately it might be helpful in your own head to be like, I'm going to focus on this thing, but I wouldn't sweat it too much. Maybe really focus on story for the next one, and then maybe do the following film that you're like, you know what, this is a lot about lighting. I'm going to put a lot of time and energy into learning lighting before this following film. So what are the needs and expectations of the story that you're going to tell? And does that provide you an opportunity to learn and embed yourself into that particular world? So let's say it's not a very complicated lighting one, and actually the story is very straightforward, so you know what it is inside out, you've already done your research, so could you then focus on composition? So look at the different aspects of filmmaking that are the most imperative to the story that you're telling at that moment, and that's what I would focus on, and do it on a per film basis. And if you make enough films, this doesn't matter, because you're just going to get a chance to specialize in all these things for all these different films. So I think just keep going and make as many as you can, and then it doesn't matter, just work your way through all of them. So rather than spend a month working out which one you should be focusing on, you could make 3 films in that month and do one focusing on each.
Yeah, and I think
that's my holistic answer.
I think it's almost impossible to focus on one or the other. I think they'll come hand in hand naturally. Spending time with people on set or who have similar interests to you, and just doing it, you'll learn how to tell stories through lighting and visually in general.
I agree. But anyway, smashing episode. Thank you so much for joining me, Ellen. Thank you to Steve for joining us as well. What a treat that was.
My brain feels considerably bigger.
My brain feels itched, but also tickled. So I feel like I've had a nice little brain scratch, but then also a tickle, because I'm now just I'm thirsty for more knowledge, more wisdom. And stuff,
That's a great place to be.
That is a great place to be. But yeah, anyway, do send your questions to podcast@youngfilmacademy.co.uk, and we hope to answer them on a relevant future episode. Thank you for joining, guys.
See you next time.
See you next time.